Somebody help. Two children are lost in the blizzard. The wind howled through the Wyoming night as 10-year-old twins in party clothes stumbled toward the frozen river, their breath turning to ice in the air. Behind them, the golden chandeliers of the grand engagement banquet kept glowing, laughter echoing as if nothing was wrong. But in 30 seconds, a blind German shepherd would change their fate forever and uncover the secret their father's fiancée had tried desperately to bury. The town of Willow Creek lay wrapped in the early clutch of winter, its streets lined with frosted pines and roofs already wearing a thin crust of white. Montana's December sky was the color of pewter, and the air carried the metallic tang of an approaching snowstorm. From the tallest building in town, the Grand Willows Hotel, light spilled through tall arched windows, golden against the steel-gray afternoon. Inside, the ballroom glowed with chandeliers, firelight flickered from a grand stone hearth, and the warmth was thick with the smell of roasted meats and mulled cider. Tonight was a celebration, the engagement of Daniel Carter and Monica Price. Daniel Carter, 42, stood near the head table, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark chestnut hair just beginning to silver at the temples. Years of managing Carter Ranch Holdings, a chain of high-end cattle ranch resorts, had etched faint lines at the corners of his hazel eyes. His neatly pressed charcoal suit fit like it had been made for him, and his handshake was the kind that conveyed calm authority. People often said Daniel had an unshakable presence, but those who knew him well understood that beneath that steadiness was a man who had carried grief quietly since his wife's passing 2 years ago. His protective love for his children, Ethan and Emily, was fierce, though his work often kept him away longer than he wished. Beside him stood Monica Price, 38, in a fitted sapphire blue gown that shimmered as she moved. She had an angular beauty, high cheekbones, ice blonde hair swept into a sleek chignon, and a smile that was more calculated than warm. A corporate strategist from Seattle, Monica was admired for her confidence and skill in high-stakes negotiations. Yet her perfectionism often tipped into coldness, a trait sharpened by a childhood where she'd been taught that emotions were liabilities. In public, she was the picture of charm, but in private moments, her tone could cut like glass. Across the ballroom, Ethan and Emily Carter lingered near the dessert table. The 8-year-old twins shared the same tousled light brown hair and inquisitive green eyes, but where Ethan's energy tended to burst outward in restless movement, Emily's curiosity showed in her quiet watchfulness. Both wore formal outfits picked by Monica, Ethan in a miniature navy blazer and Emily in a cream dress with a stiff skirt. They were used to polite smiles from adults they barely knew, but tonight, the weight of the evening felt heavier than usual. When Monica approached, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor, the twins straightened instinctively. She crouched to their height, her smile still fixed in place for anyone watching from across the room. "You two should start practicing calling me Mom," she said in a tone sweet enough to carry, but edged with something sharp. "Your real mother isn't coming back. The sooner you accept that, the happier you'll be." The words landed like ice between them. Ethan's jaw tightened, and Emily's small hands twisted in the folds of her skirt. Without speaking, they exchanged a glance that only twins could read, a shared impulse to flee. Slipping quietly toward the side doors, while the music swelled and guests laughed over champagne, they passed unnoticed into the hallway. Beyond the hotel's glass doors, the first flakes of snow had begun to drift lazily down, melting on contact with the blacktop. The cold slapped their cheeks as they stepped outside, the air suddenly still, except for the distant hum of the party upstairs. Without looking back, they started down the sidewalk toward the dim glow of the street lamps. On the other side of Willow Creek, several blocks from the grandeur of the Grand Willows Hotel, Claire Thompson zipped her heavy olive green parka and adjusted the thick wool scarf around her neck. 35 years old, she carried the quiet strength of someone who had seen both the worst and best in people. Her auburn hair, threaded here and there with strands of early gray, was tucked beneath a knit beanie, and her blue-gray eyes were the kind that noticed details others missed. Claire had served 12 years as an Army medic, including 2 tours overseas before returning to civilian life. The loss of a close comrade in her last deployment had left her with a deeper appreciation for small acts of kindness and a lingering restlessness that kept her moving. At her side trotted Shadow, her German shepherd, a large, imposing figure of black and tan fur. Shadow was 9 years old and completely blind, his milky eyes hidden behind a neatly tied white bandana that served both as a signal to others and protection from harsh winds. Once a military working dog trained for search and rescue, Shadow had lost his sight during an explosion on a disaster relief mission. Despite this, his hearing was razor sharp, and his sense of smell mapped the world for him with remarkable precision. Where sight once guided him, now subtle scents and faint vibrations under his paws told him everything he needed to know. Claire's destination tonight was the small bungalow of Mr. Howard Bennett, an 80-year-old retired railroad worker who lived alone near the edge of town. Winters in Willow Creek could be merciless, and Claire had made it a habit to check in on him whenever storms were forecast. As she and Shadow moved along the quiet street, the snow began to fall harder, stinging against exposed skin. Shadow's ears swiveled, catching distant sounds, wind rattling a loose gutter, the creak of a porch swing, and something else, faint and rhythmic from much farther away. Claire followed his lead, adjusting her pace as the wind carried the smell of wood smoke from Howard's chimney. Back at the hotel, Daniel scanned the crowd from where he stood with a pair of investors, realizing he hadn't seen Ethan and Emily for several minutes. Monica reappeared at his side, her smile still flawless. "The children have wandered off," she murmured lightly, though her eyes held no real concern. "They're probably hiding somewhere, playing games." Daniel excused himself, the first flicker of unease passing through him, but he didn't yet know that. Outside, the snow was thickening, the temperature dropping, and his children were two small figures disappearing down the empty street. Ethan and Emily walked quickly, their breaths turning into pale clouds in the air. Neither spoke, both feeling the unspoken urgency to put distance between themselves and Monica's words. The snow crunched softly beneath their polished shoes, already damp at the toes. Street by street, Willow Creek was transforming under the storm's touch, storefront signs blurred by snowfall, cars tucked under rising drifts, the sky growing darker with each passing minute. At the same time, Claire reached Howard Bennett's front steps, knocking firmly before stepping back. The old man answered in his familiar wool cardigan, his silver hair slightly mussed. "Evening, Claire, and Shadow, of course," he greeted warmly. Claire smiled, handing him a small bag of groceries. They chatted briefly about the forecast, and she reminded him to keep the radio tuned to the weather station. Shadow lay patiently at her feet, head turning toward the street as if tracking something only he could sense. When they left a few minutes later, the snow had begun to fall in thick, wind-blown sheets. Claire tugged her hood higher, and Shadow pressed closer to her leg, navigating each step with practiced confidence. Two different paths, both swallowed by the same storm. Two children seeking escape from words that hurt more than they understood, and a woman with a blind shepherd moving through the cold to keep someone else safe. Neither knew yet how soon their paths would cross, or how the snowstorm descending on Willow Creek would change the shape of all their lives. The snow had thickened into a curtain of white, swallowing the edges of Willow Creek until streets and rooftops melted into the same pale blur. Street lamps glowed dimly, their halos shrinking under the force of the storm. Ethan and Emily pressed forward against the wind, their faces stung red, boots slipping on patches of ice hidden beneath the powder. The world was quieter out here, muffled by snow, but the silence only made them more aware of how far they'd wandered from the warmth of the Grand Willows Hotel. Ethan kept glancing back, as if the ballroom might still be within sight. But there was nothing, just the indistinct shadow of a building or two, swallowed as quickly as it appeared. Emily's breath came in short bursts, her scarf pulled up high. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Ethan shrugged, trying to sound confident, though he wasn't sure himself. "Away from her." They followed the faint impression of a trail that sloped toward the lower part of town, unaware it would lead them dangerously close to Willow Creek's frozen river. Across town, Claire and Shadow were retracing their route from Mr. Bennett's home. The wind had picked up, tugging at Claire's hood and flattening her scarf against her chin. Shadow walked slightly ahead, his paws pressing into the snow in a rhythm that matched Claire's own steps. Despite his blindness, he moved with assurance, the faint crunch of ice and the sharp scent of distant pine guiding him. Claire's mind was already on the fire she planned to light when she got home, but then Shadow stopped abruptly, his head tilting toward the east. A low, uncertain whine left his throat. "What is it, boy?" Claire asked, tightening her grip on his harness. Shadow's ears twitched, nostrils flaring. Then came the sound, a faint, uneven sobbing carried by the wind. Ethan and Emily had reached the river's edge without realizing it. In summer, it was a wide ribbon of water where children fished and kayakers drifted lazily downstream. Now it was frozen, a glassy sheet masked by snow. The banks were slippery, and the storm had erased the line between safe ground and thin ice. Emily's foot skidded forward, making her stumble dangerously close to the edge. Ethan caught her arm, but the sudden movement sent them both sprawling into the snow. That was when they heard it, a sharp bark cutting through the howl of the wind. Claire recognized Shadow's bark as his alert call, a sound he'd learned in the military to indicate he'd found someone in distress. She couldn't see through the storm, but she trusted him completely. "Lead the way," she urged, releasing the slack on his harness. Shadow surged forward, nose low, weaving through snowdrifts with uncanny precision. The sound of crying grew louder, more distinct, two voices, trembling but alive. Through the haze of white, Claire made out two small figures huddled near the base of a bare willow tree. Their clothes dusted in snow, hair damp with melting flakes. She dropped to her knees beside them. Up close, she could see the boy's jaw clenched against the cold, the girl's lips pale and trembling. "Hey, you're safe now," Claire said, her voice warm and steady despite her quickened breath. She shrugged off her backpack, pulling out a thermal blanket and wrapping it around them both, tucking the edges under their chins. "Let's get you warm." Shadow stood close, his head tilted toward Emily. He sniffed at her scarf, then pressed his nose gently into her mittened hand, tail giving a slow wag. Emily looked surprised, but didn't pull away. Claire studied them, recognizing the formal clothes ill-suited for weather like this, the way they leaned instinctively toward each other. "What are your names?" she asked, checking for signs of frostbite. "Ethan," the boy said, still wary. "This is my sister Emily." Claire nodded, memorizing their faces. "I'm Claire, and this is Shadow. He can't see, but he's the best at finding people who need help." It was in that moment, as Emily whispered a soft, "Hi, Shadow," that the dog's ears flicked sharply. Claire had seen that reaction before, once in the middle of a base hospital in Kabul when Shadow had turned toward the voice of a nurse who had saved his life after the explosion. Emily's tone, gentle and lilting, carried the same timbre. Claire's chest tightened. She remembered reading a news clipping about the Carter children's mother, a volunteer nurse who died in a car accident. Before Claire could ask more, movement caught her eye. A tall figure in a dark overcoat was cutting through the snow toward them, moving fast despite the wind. Daniel Carter's face was tight with worry, snow clinging to his hair and lashes. "Ethan! Emily!" His voice cracked as he reached them, dropping to gather both into his arms. Relief flooded his features, followed by confusion as he looked at Claire. "You found them?" he asked. Claire rose to her feet, brushing snow from her knees. "They were near the river. Shadow heard them before I did." Daniel's gaze shifted to the dog, taking in the white bandana, then back to Claire. "Thank you. His words faltered, the weight of what could have happened sinking in. "Thank you," he repeated, quieter this time. Snow swirled harder around them, and Claire adjusted the blanket tighter around the twins. "You should get them inside. Their hands are freezing, but they'll be fine once they're warm." Daniel nodded, but Ethan and Emily clung to the edges of the blanket as if reluctant to let Claire and Shadow go. Emily reached down to pat the dog's head, her voice just loud enough to carry over the wind. "You remind me of someone," she said, her breath fogging in the air. Shadow stayed still under her touch, his tail giving another slow wag as if he too remembered. With the storm building, Daniel gestured toward the street. "Let's go. The hotel's close." He walked ahead with the twins, but when Claire turned to head in the opposite direction, Ethan twisted back to wave. Shadow tilted his head toward the motion, his blind eyes following the gesture as if he could see it. Claire's hand lingered on his harness, her mind replaying Emily's voice, the way it had struck a note buried deep in the dog's memory, and, she realized with a start, in her own. The storm had not let up overnight. Morning light in Willow Creek was a pale, silvery thing, diffused through layers of snowfall that still drifted lazily from the sky. The Grand Willows Hotel stood like a warm fortress against the cold, its grand arched windows glowing with lamplight. Inside, the crackle of the central fireplace mingled with the soft hum of breakfast chatter, though, at one corner of the lobby, the air felt decidedly more tense. Daniel Carter, a tall man in his late 30s with an athlete's build softened slightly by years behind a desk, stood by the hearth with a cup of black coffee in hand. His hazel eyes were shadowed by a restless night. Across from him sat Claire Morgan, still wearing her snow boots and the worn navy parka from the night before. She had the calm, deliberate air of someone used to solving practical problems, her light brown hair pulled into a loose braid, a few strands curling around her face. "I can't thank you enough," Daniel began, glancing toward the breakfast room where Ethan and Emily were eating oatmeal, Shadow sitting faithfully beside their table. "You found them before." He stopped himself, swallowing the thought. "Look, I was wondering, just for a few days, could you help look after them? My schedule's impossible this week, and clearly they've taken to you." Before Claire could respond, a sharp, measured voice cut across the space. Monica Hayes approached, her heels clicking on the polished wood floor. In her early 30s, Monica was striking in a controlled, deliberate way. Platinum blonde hair in a perfect chignon, tailored cream coat belted neatly at the waist. Her beauty had an edge to it, as though carved by precision rather than warmth. "Daniel," she said smoothly, "surely you don't mean to leave your children with—" Her gaze flicked over Claire, taking in the scuffed boots and worn coat. Dog trainer?" Claire's brows lifted slightly, but she said nothing. Monica's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "It's just, given her background, perhaps it isn't the best influence?" Her voice was quiet, but sharp enough for the sting to land. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Claire's the reason they're safe right now. That matters more than her background." Claire spoke before Daniel could continue. "If you're asking whether I'll help, I will. Not because of what she thinks of me, but because they deserve someone who listens." Later that day, in the warm, book-lined sitting room on the hotel's second floor, Ethan and Emily sprawled on a patterned rug beside Shadow. Claire had introduced the idea of a story circle at 8 p.m., a nightly moment where they could talk about their mom or tell Shadow something about their day. She knew the first night might be awkward, so she started with her own story. "When Shadow was young," she began, her voice low and steady, "he was part of a rescue unit, overseas. He learned to find people trapped after storms or bombings. One day, he saved me from a collapsed wall by barking until help came." Her eyes softened as she remembered. "After that, we were a team. He can't see anymore, but he still finds people, because he listens." Ethan reached out to scratch Shadow's ear. "Like last night?" "Exactly," Claire said, "and you two can learn to talk to him, even without words." From that evening on, Shadow began training the twins. Claire taught them how to give simple hand signals that Shadow could recognize through scent and sound. If Ethan snapped twice and tapped the floor, Shadow would lie down beside him. If Emily clapped once and spoke his name softly, Shadow would turn his head toward her and wait. The lessons required patience. Sometimes Shadow would hesitate, testing if they'd try again. "He's not being stubborn," Claire explained. "He's teaching you to pay attention." In the days that followed, the ritual at 8 p.m. became their anchor. Sometimes Ethan would talk about how his mom used to hum while making pancakes. Sometimes Emily would describe the way she smelled of cinnamon after baking. On other nights, they asked Claire to tell more about Shadow's days as a rescue dog, about the helicopter rides, the crowded relief tents, the times he stood guard through the night. Shadow would lie between them, occasionally letting out a quiet sigh as if he remembered too. Monica, meanwhile, made no secret of her disapproval. She would pass by the sitting room, offering comments disguised as concern. "Are they hearing stories about war now? Isn't that a bit grim?" But Daniel, though often silent, would glance toward the twins' peaceful faces and say nothing to stop Claire. One evening, during Shadow's training session, a hotel guest stopped to watch. This was Mrs. Hargrove, an elderly woman with a crown of snow-white hair and a fur-lined shawl. Her eyes were pale blue and twinkled with curiosity. "That's quite the intelligent shepherd," she said warmly. "My husband trained search dogs in the Rockies. I haven't seen such patience in children for years." She gave Claire an approving nod before shuffling away. The twins beamed at the compliment, and Shadow gave a short, pleased bark. By the end of the week, Claire noticed small changes. Ethan was quicker to smile, Emily spoke more freely, and both seemed to meet the world with a bit more confidence. But under the surface, Monica's resentment simmered, waiting for the right moment to boil over. Claire knew the seeds of conflict had been planted. What she didn't yet know was how deep their roots would go. The snow in Willow Creek had stopped 2 days ago, but the cold remained sharp and unyielding, the kind that turned breath into thin white clouds and made every sound seem crisp in the air. Streets were lined with snowbanks piled high by plows, and a pale winter sun hung low over the rooftops. At the Grand Willows Hotel, Monica sat in the lounge, perfectly composed in a charcoal cashmere sweater and slim black trousers. Her manicured nails tapped lightly on the armrest as she listened to a man across from her, a private investigator named Travis Dean. Travis was in his early 40s, with a wiry build, a graying goatee, and a lined face that hinted at years of watching people from behind the wheel of a car. He handed Monica a small stack of photos. "She's been taking them here. Haven House," he said. "Community center on the east side, mostly veterans and low-income families." Monica flipped through the pictures. Claire walking with Ethan and Emily, the children carrying grocery bags inside, the old German shepherd at their side. Her lips tightened. "So, she's teaching them to... what? Pity the poor?" Monica's voice dripped with disdain. "Or worse, to think they should feel guilty for what they have." "That's not my business," Travis replied, his voice flat. "I just take the photos." Monica dismissed him with a wave, already plotting her next move. That evening, she confronted Daniel in the hotel lobby. "Did you know Claire has been taking them to a shelter? Haven House. She's planting ideas in their heads that they should be ashamed of their life. Do you really want them to grow up resenting everything you've worked for?" Daniel's brows knit. "Or maybe she's showing them something I haven't. I'll see for myself before I judge." Without waiting for her reply, he grabbed his coat and headed into the freezing night. The drive to Haven House took him past blocks of modest homes and small shops, their windows glowing warmly against the dark. The building itself was a sturdy brick structure with a mural of clasped hands painted across one wall. Inside, the scent of stew and fresh bread filled the air, mingling with the low murmur of conversation. Through the open doors of the dining hall, Daniel spotted Ethan and Emily at a long table, carefully ladling soup into bowls for a line of people. Men and women in worn coats, some with military patches on their sleeves. Claire stood nearby, helping to carry trays. The twins moved with quiet focus, their faces lit with smiles as they chatted with guests. Daniel stayed at the doorway for a long moment, taking it in. One of the veterans, a tall man in his 60s with a weathered face and a limp, leaned down to speak to Emily. She giggled at something he said, then passed him a bowl of soup. Daniel realized with a pang that this was not guilt he was seeing. It was connection, curiosity, and warmth. Meanwhile, outside in the courtyard, the air was biting cold and the snow crunched underfoot. Shadow was sniffing intently near the fence, his white blindfold stark against his dark fur. Ethan stood nearby, watching. "What's he doing?" Daniel asked quietly, coming up behind him. Ethan's face lit up. One of the veterans, Mr. Callahan, lost his necklace in the snow. Shadow's looking for it. Mr. Callahan was a short, wiry man in his late 70s, bundled in an old army coat. His hands fidgeted as he explained to Daniel, "It's a small silver chain. My wife gave it to me before I shipped out. I thought I'd never see it again." Shadow's ears twitched, and he began circling a patch of snow, nose low to the ground. A moment later, he stopped and pawed lightly, then barked once, short and certain. Ethan dropped to his knees, digging gently until a glint of silver appeared. He pulled out the chain and held it up, grinning. Mr. Callahan's eyes shone as he clasped it in his hands. "Bless that dog," he said hoarsely, "and bless you, son." Inside again, Daniel watched the twins laugh with the veterans as they served dessert, apple crumble from the hotel kitchen that Claire had brought along. There was no trace of shame in their expressions, only joy in sharing. He felt something shift in him, a quiet understanding that what they were learning here could never be bought or taught in a classroom. When the evening wound down, Daniel stepped outside with Claire as the twins bundled up. The cold air stung his cheeks, but there was a warmth in his voice when he said, "You were right. This isn't about guilt. It's about giving them something real." Claire just smiled, her breath clouding in the night air. Shadow pressed his head gently against Emily's leg, as though he too knew that tonight had meant something important. The winter in Willow Creek had been harsh, but nothing compared to the blizzard forecast for that weekend. Monica had been unusually sweet for 2 days, her tone honeyed as she proposed a family getaway to a secluded mountain resort 2 hours away. She wore a deep burgundy wool dress that flattered her tall, willowy frame, and her pale blonde hair was twisted neatly into an elegant knot. To Daniel, she looked every bit the polished socialite, but her eyes gleamed with quiet calculation. "It will be good for the children," she said. "A break from certain influences. Just us. No distractions." Daniel hesitated, but agreed, telling himself a weekend might not hurt. The resort was a sprawling log and stone lodge surrounded by dense pine forests, the kind of place where fireplaces burned constantly and thick rugs muffled every step. Staff moved quietly through the hallways, and the smell of cedar lingered in the air. Ethan and Emily, however, were restless. The wide windows framed only a curtain of falling snow, and the endless polite chatter in the dining hall felt stifling compared to the warmth and laughter they had shared at Haven House. Monica's watchful gaze followed them constantly, her lips tightening whenever they whispered to each other. By the second evening, the blizzard hit in earnest. The wind howled outside like a chorus of ghosts, rattling the windows and swirling snow in blinding sheets. Monica, sipping wine by the fire, told the twins they would be staying inside for their own safety. But Ethan and Emily had been quietly plotting. They missed Claire, missed Shadow, missed the feeling of being seen and heard without judgment. Just before midnight, bundled in oversized coats and scarves, they slipped out a side door while Monica was upstairs. The cold slammed into them like a wall, but they pushed forward into the snow, aiming for the narrow trail they remembered from the drive-in. The wind tore at their hoods, and the beam of Ethan's flashlight barely pierced the swirling white. Before long, the trail vanished, swallowed by drifts. Back in Willow Creek, Claire was closing up Haven House after a late meeting with volunteers. She wore her old olive parka, patched at the elbows, and her dark hair was pulled into a messy braid. Beside her, Shadow paced restlessly, ears pricking toward the wind. His white blindfold fluttered slightly as he lifted his head to sniff the air. Claire frowned. Shadow only got this tense when something was wrong. She opened the door to the cold, and the German Shepherd moved forward decisively, nose working. Miles away, the twins huddled together under a snow-laden pine, shivering. Emily's cheeks were raw with cold, and Ethan's gloved hands shook as he tried to keep the flashlight steady. The wind carried a faint sound. Was it barking? Ethan strained to listen. There it was again, closer this time, urgent and rhythmic. Through the blur of snow, a dark shape appeared, moving with surprising certainty over the drifts. Shadow bounded toward them, his paws sure despite his blindness, guided by the familiar scents of wool coats, shampoo, and the faint traces of cinnamon cookies Emily had eaten that afternoon. Behind him, Claire's figure emerged, breathless but steady. "I've got you!" she shouted over the wind, throwing her arms around both children and tucking them under the thick blanket she had carried. The return to the resort was a battle against the storm. Claire's boots sank deep with each step, and the snow stung her face. Shadow trotted slightly ahead, his head turning occasionally to check their position, adjusting their path like a seasoned guide. When they finally reached the warm glow of the lodge lights, Daniel was standing outside, face pale and drawn. He rushed forward, scooping both children into his arms, then turned to Claire. For a long moment, he said nothing, just looked at her with something unspoken in his eyes. Monica appeared at the doorway, her expression flickering between surprise and irritation. "What is she doing here?" she demanded. But Daniel's voice was calm, resolute. "She's here because she's family, because tonight she and Shadow risked their lives for my children while you were pouring another glass of wine." Monica's face froze, her perfect posture rigid. "Daniel," she began, but he cut her off. No, Monica, this ends here. In the lobby, with the storm still raging outside, Daniel took a deep breath. I'm canceling the engagement, he said, his voice firm. And I'm asking you, Claire, and you, Shadow, to stay. Not just tonight, stay as part of this family. Claire blinked, taken aback, but the warmth in Ethan and Emily's faces told her everything she needed to know. Spring came slowly to Willow Creek, the snow retreating to reveal green shoots and soft earth. On a bright Saturday morning, Haven House bustled with activity. A new sign hung over the entrance, Shadow's Light. The program, dreamed up by Daniel, Claire, and the twins, taught children skills for surviving in the wild and for caring for others. Ethan and Emily led a group through knot-tying exercises, while Claire showed them how to read the sky for weather changes. Shadow lay nearby on a blanket, listening to the laughter. A small boy sat beside him, running curious fingers over his fur, as Claire told the story of how Shadow, once a military rescue dog, had found his way into their lives. The air was full of the scent of fresh-baked bread from the kitchen and the bright chatter of children who had learned, through one winter storms, that family is built not just by blood, but by choice and courage. Sometimes God sends miracles not through angels with wings, but through people and creatures who walk beside us every day. Claire and Shadow were not just rescuers in a storm, they were reminders that love, courage, and compassion are divine gifts. In our own lives, storms will come, some with snow and wind, others with loss, fear, or loneliness. But God will always place someone in our path to guide us home. If you believe that God still works through the hands of the humble and the hearts of the faithful, I invite you to share this story with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us about a moment when God sent help your way. Subscribe to join our family of stories filled with faith, kindness, and redemption. And if your heart agrees, type Amen in the comments, so together we can thank the Lord for His mercy and ask Him to bless every soul watching this now. May God watch over you and your loved ones today and always.